You know, there's something rather curious that happens to people. After watching human beings navigate their lives for long enough, you begin to notice a pattern. The ones who are standing at the edge of something genuinely transformative, who are about to step into an entirely new quality of existence, they're rarely excited. In fact, they usually feel confused, disconnected, restless, as if something that once gave their life meaning had quietly stopped working. Now, most people assume these feelings mean something has gone wrong. But what if they mean something very different? What if before you enter a completely new chapter of being, the psyche sends signals, not just one or two, but a whole pattern of signs that appears again and again across different lives, different ages, different circumstances? The trouble is, almost nobody recognizes them when they arrive. People mistake them for failure, for burnout, for depression, for what we've labeled a midlife crisis. And because they misunderstand what's happening, they run back to the very life they were meant to outgrow. So here's the question. What if the confusion you're feeling right now isn't a sign that you're lost? What if the emptiness, the restlessness, the strange sense that your old life no longer fits you, are actually signs that something in you is trying to wake up? Because the best chapter of a person's life rarely begins when everything is working. It begins when the old life starts losing its grip. Let me show you what often appears when someone is standing at that threshold, and why the period that feels most uncertain is often the beginning of something far more meaningful than you realize. If you recognize yourself in these signs, what you're experiencing may not be a breakdown at all. It may be the beginning of the chapter you were always meant to live. The life you built wasn't really yours. Most people believe that a crisis begins when something goes wrong, a loss, a betrayal, a failure that cannot be hidden. But here's what's far more unsettling. Sometimes people arrive at a point of devastation not because their lives have fallen apart, but because their lives have gone exactly according to plan. The career was built, the family was formed, the achievements were real. And yet beneath all of it, something feels borrowed, inherited, like wearing a coat that was tailored for someone else's body. You've worn it long enough that you forgot it was never cut for you. But the body remembers. The body always remembers. The mask we build, this role we construct to be accepted, to be loved, to be safe inside the structures we were born into, this is what we might call the persona. And here's the thing. The person you've been presenting to the world, the responsible one, the capable one, the one who has it together, may not be you at all. It may be the most sophisticated survival mechanism your psyche ever built. You didn't just inherit your mother's expectations or your father's ambitions. You inherited entire patterns of being, cultural scripts that run so deep most people never question whether they wrote them. The successful professional, the good partner, the person who doesn't complain, the person who pushes through. These aren't personal instructions. They're inherited ways of being that were already ancient before you were born. And the trouble with living inside a pattern you never consciously chose is this. You can succeed completely at being it and still feel like you're disappearing. Take someone like Elena, a brilliant lawyer, a caring mother, successful by every available measure. And standing before her mirror at 41, she felt less authentic than at any other time in her life. Not because she'd failed at the script, because she'd mastered it. She'd given the best performance of her life, and now she could no longer find herself behind it. This isn't a crisis. This is the beginning of individuation. The moment the soul decides it will no longer live inside a story written by someone else. The moment the real person, the one buried under decades of performance, begins to push toward the surface. It doesn't feel like awakening at first. It feels like something's wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You've simply outgrown the coat. When everything stops making sense. Now there's an old alchemical understanding about transformation. Before base material can become gold, it has to decompose completely. The structure has to dissolve. The original form has to be surrendered, and that dissolution looks from every angle like pure loss. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. This isn't poetry, it's mechanism. The pain you're experiencing isn't a signal that something's going wrong. It's the signal that something's going right, something your ego doesn't want. Something your ego will fight with everything it has. Here's the distinction that changes everything. The ego doesn't want transformation. The ego wants improvement. It wants to become a better version of itself while remaining fundamentally the same. It wants to add new capabilities, new relationships, new achievements to its existing structure without ever questioning whether that structure needs to come down entirely. Every self-help book, every productivity system, every three-step program promising rapid transformation, they all speak to the ego. They promise that you can get to the other side without going through the middle, that you can have the new chapter without allowing the old one to actually end. But this is the ego's desperate attempt to avoid the one thing that could actually transform it: dissolution. Think about what happens in nature during winter. Everything above ground goes dormant. The landscape looks barren, lifeless. If you didn't understand seasons, you'd assume the earth was finished producing anything. But underneath that frozen surface, the soil is restructuring itself. Root systems are deepening in ways they never could during the busy growing season. The apparent death is the condition for the next period of growth. Elena spent 6 months trying to fix what she was feeling. Every solution worked briefly. None of them touched the actual thing. She described it later this way: "It felt like she was rearranging furniture in a house that needed to be rebuilt from the foundation." She was right, and the moment she stopped trying to rearrange the furniture was the moment everything finally began. The 4 signs you're already crossing over. There are specific markers, things that appear consistently in people who are approaching a major life transformation. These markers are almost always misread by the people experiencing them. They look like symptoms of something going wrong. They're actually signs of something going right. The first is a hollowing out of things that used to carry meaning. You wake up and the life you've built, the one that met all the criteria, feels like a theater set for a production that already closed. You go through the motions because you don't know what else to do. The emotional current that used to run through your routines, your goals, your relationships, has thinned to almost nothing. People around you don't notice because you're still performing. But inside, you feel as though you're watching your own life from a slight distance, through glass, and what you see no longer makes sense to you. This is the psyche withdrawing its energy from structures that have completed their function. Think of the way sap retreats from branches in autumn. The branches don't break, they just go quiet. And the energy that used to flow through them begins pooling somewhere deeper, preparing to fuel something you cannot yet see or name. The second marker is an uprising from places you thought were settled. You start dreaming vividly, dreams that feel significant even when they resist explanation. Memories surface that you haven't thought about in decades. Emotions arrive with no apparent cause. You cry without knowing why. You feel waves of anger that don't connect to anything happening in your present life. Old wounds you believed you'd healed begin aching again, as though they'd only been sleeping. This is the unconscious making its move. When the ego's grip on consciousness loosens, when the old identity starts losing its authority, everything that was compressed underneath that identity begins rising. Every feeling you set aside because you didn't have time for it, every part of yourself you rejected in order to fit into the life you were building, all of it starts coming up. And the pressure behind it is enormous because it's been held down for years, sometimes for decades. The third marker is an intense, almost physical need for solitude that no one in your life understands. You cancel plans. You need more time alone, than you ever have. Social situations that used to feel natural begin to feel like they're taking something essential from you. You're not depressed exactly. You just can't be around other people without sensing that something important is leaking out of you. Like every interaction requires you to perform a version of yourself that's becoming impossible to sustain. This is the psyche conserving its resources. Transformation requires enormous internal energy, and the psyche begins redirecting that energy away from external engagement and toward the interior work that's underway. Your need for solitude in this period is as legitimate as the body's need for stillness during illness. Something inside you is being rebuilt, and the rebuilding requires the energy you've been giving away to everything and everyone else. The fourth marker is the one that frightens people most, and it's the one most commonly misdiagnosed. It's not simply that your tastes change or your goals lose their pull, though those things happen too. It's something stranger and more specific than that. It's the arrival of feelings and impulses and desires that you've spent your whole life refusing to acknowledge. A restlessness that doesn't belong to your current life. A strange grief for a version of yourself you never allowed to exist. An inexplicable envy, not of what other people have, but of how freely some people seem to be living. What you're encountering here is the shadow. The parts of the self that were rejected or suppressed, not because they were evil, but because they didn't fit into the persona you were building. The creative impulse you set aside because it wasn't practical. The need for freedom you buried because responsibility demanded otherwise. The authentic emotional life you flattened because it made other people uncomfortable. One doesn't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness that's arriving isn't your enemy. It's the part of you that's been waiting the longest, the unlived self knocking from the inside. Not to destroy what you've built, but to demand that you finally let it exist. If you're sitting with 2 or 3 of these markers right now, you're not broken, you're not falling apart, you're standing at the threshold. And what happens next depends entirely on whether you can resist the pull to retreat back to the familiar before the new thing has a chance to form. The gap between 2 breaths. This is where most people lose the transformation that's trying to happen. Not during the hollowing out or the rising of old pain, but in the silence that comes after, when the old structure is gone or going and the new one hasn't yet arrived. When there's nothing left to hold on to and nothing visible to move toward. This is a kind of psychological freefall, and that's exactly what it feels like. The goals that once organized your days have dissolved. The identity you used to navigate the world has lost its coherence. The story you told about who you are and why your life matters has stopped making sense. And you're left in a void that the ego experiences as the most threatening thing it's ever encountered. Because the ego survives through structure, through knowing, through having a plan, a role, a reason. When all of that is stripped away, the ego goes into primal panic. This isn't a metaphor. The human brain is wired for loss aversion. The fear of losing what we have is neurologically twice as powerful as the anticipation of gaining something equivalent. The brain registers this kind of identity dissolution the same way it registers physical danger, and it responds accordingly with every survival mechanism it's ever developed. This is the moment when people call the former partner, take the job they know will make them miserable, rebuild the persona they'd finally started shedding, make peace with the life that was slowly suffocating them, because at least that life has a shape they recognize. You see this happen constantly. Someone standing at the very edge of genuine change, the old life crumbling, the new self stirring underneath. And then they panic. They grab onto the wreckage of what's falling apart and try to reassemble it. And they succeed, sort of. The relationship returns to shaky ground. The career continues with renewed but hollow determination. And from the outside it looks like recovery, like they'd weathered the storm. But what they're carrying now is the pain of the unlived life, the particular weight of a person who came to the edge of becoming something genuine and turned back, not because they lacked strength, but because they couldn't tolerate not knowing for long enough. There's an image that helps me understand this threshold. Think about the space between two breaths. After you exhale completely and before you inhale again, there's a moment of absolute suspension. Nothing moving, nothing happening. From the inside, it can feel like panic if you're paying attention to it, like the air might never return. But that pause isn't emptiness. It's the moment the body reorganizes itself to receive the next breath. The stillness isn't the absence of life, it's the condition for life's continuation. The gap between your old chapter and your new one works the same way. The void that feels like nothing is actually where the new self is taking shape. The emptiness isn't the absence of meaning, it's the space where meaning that is actually yours, meaning not inherited or performed or borrowed from anyone else's idea of what your life should look like, is quietly gathering the strength to emerge. Elena reached this gap 3 separate times over the course of a year and a half. 3 times she picked up the phone to call her old managing partner and ask for her position back. 3 times something stopped her. Not wisdom exactly. She described it as a physical sensation, a tightness in her chest that came when her hand touched the phone, as though her body knew something her mind was still arguing about. She didn't call. She stayed in the gap. And what came through wasn't what she expected. What the darkness is actually doing to you. People are taught to endure the darkness, to survive it, to white-knuckle through it until the light returns. But what if we had a completely different relationship with it? What if we didn't just want to endure the darkness, but to see what's alive inside it? Because the darkness, the real psychological darkness of the threshold period, isn't inert. It isn't an absence. It's the most active, most purposeful space a human being can inhabit. And what it's doing, if you let it, is something the light never could. The alchemists described 3 stages in transformation. The first was the nigredo, the blackening and dissolution. The second was the albedo, the whitening, the stage where light begins to penetrate the darkness, where what was dissolved starts to become visible in ways it never was before. The third was the rubedo, the reddening, the final integration into gold. Most people in the threshold period are living in the nigredo and waiting for the rubedo. They're enduring the dissolution and waiting for the gold. But they're skipping the stage that makes the gold possible. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Think about what that means in practice. The thing you've been calling love might be the fear of being abandoned. The thing you've been calling responsibility might be a lifelong compulsion to make yourself necessary so that you can't be rejected. The thing you've been calling strength might be an inability to ask for help that began as a survival strategy before you were old enough to drive a car. None of these realizations are failures. They're the albedo, the light penetrating the dissolution. And this seeing, this uncomfortable, honest, unflinching seeing, is the step that most people skip, and the reason most people never fully reach the other side. The shadow doesn't become dangerous when it's seen. It becomes dangerous when it's denied. When the parts of you that were rejected, suppressed, or locked away operate invisibly, they function as the hidden architecture of your entire life. Your reactions, your patterns, your choices in relationships, your inexplicable self-sabotage, all of it sourced from somewhere you can't access because you've never turned the light on in that room. There's a practical question that opens this stage, and it doesn't require a therapist or a meditation retreat or years of journaling. It's simply this: the most intense emotional reaction you've had in the last month. What's it actually about? Not the surface reason, not the story you told yourself or someone else. What's underneath it? What wound does it touch? What fear does it confirm? That question, held honestly, without rushing to answer it, is the doorway into the albedo. And walking through that doorway is the single most important thing you can do in the darkness. Because what you find there isn't a monster. It's the part of you that's been waiting the longest to be seen. The unlived impulse, the buried creativity, the authentic need that you learned very young to pretend didn't exist. Once it's seen, it can't be unseen. Once it's integrated, it stops being fate. It becomes energy, the most powerful energy you've ever had access to, because it's been held under pressure for years, and it's finally free. The moment everything turns into its opposite. Here's something rather extraordinary that happens. The period of deepest isolation, the one that feels like you've been permanently separated from every genuine connection you ever had, almost always precedes the arrival of the most authentic relationships of a person's life. The moment of most complete meaninglessness, when nothing you've ever believed in seems to hold any truth, often gives birth to a sense of purpose so precise and personal that it carries a quality the borrowed sense of purpose never did. The time when a person feels most completely lost, most disoriented, most certain they've taken a wrong turn somewhere irreversible, is frequently the exact period when they're for the first time heading in the right direction. This isn't wishful thinking. This is what happens when the ego's agenda finally exhausts itself. When all the planning and strategy and forced optimism run out of fuel, the deeper intelligence of the psyche finally gets a chance to speak. And this deeper intelligence has been paying attention to everything your conscious mind was too busy performing to notice. There's something else that happens in this reversal, something we might call synchronicity, an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. When you're in the threshold, when your interior is reorganizing itself at the most fundamental level, you begin noticing things you wouldn't have noticed before. Not because those things weren't always there, but because the ego, in its ordinary state of control and performance, filters out enormous amounts of information that doesn't serve its existing narrative. When the ego loosens its grip, that filter lifts. The book that falls open to exactly the page you needed. The stranger who says the thing you've been trying to understand for months. The conversation that arrives at the precise moment a door was closing. These aren't supernatural events. They're the natural result of a psyche that's finally permeable, finally open to signals it's been blocking. Let me suggest something here, and I want you to sit with it honestly. The fact that you're watching this video right now, at this particular moment in your life, isn't a coincidence. Not because this video is magical, but because you are. Because whatever is moving in you is moving towards something, and it's finding its way to what it needs. That's not mysticism, that's the mechanism. Elena didn't find her next chapter through planning. She wasn't strategic about it. She wasn't following a program or executing a vision board. What happened was quieter and more surprising than any of that. A conversation at a friend's dinner party with a woman who ran a small non-profit supporting women through divorce. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Elena couldn't stop thinking about it for 3 weeks afterward. She felt something she hadn't felt since she was a student, since before she knew what she was supposed to become. She felt drawn towards something without any logical reason to justify it. Without a financial case, without a career ladder, without anything the old Elena would have recognized as a valid reason to make a change. When the ego's agenda is finally exhausted, the deeper intelligence of the psyche gets a chance to express itself. And it moves not through logic, but through something more like gravity, toward what is actually true, toward what has always been true and couldn't get through while the performance was running. The new chapter, when it comes, rarely looks like what the old self would have chosen, and that's exactly how you know it's real. The best chapter doesn't look like what you imagined. The best chapter of your life won't arrive the way the old chapters did. Not through goal setting, not through a better plan or a stronger morning routine or a more disciplined version of the person you've already been. It arrives through emergence, a reorganization so deep and so fundamental that your entire relationship with being alive begins to shift. Not your circumstances at first, your interior, the quality of your attention, the way you move through an ordinary day, the things that can finally reach you now that couldn't get through before. There's this concept worth sitting with, what we might call the unlived life. The version of you that existed as a real possibility before the persona was constructed. The self that was forming before you learned what was acceptable and what needed to be hidden. Before you understood which parts of yourself were welcome in the room and which ones had to wait outside. That version of you didn't disappear. It went underground. And it's been living there ever since, expressing itself in the only ways it could. As a vague longing you can't locate. As grief that arrives without a clear cause. As the strange, specific envy you feel when you watch certain people live with a freedom you told yourself was impractical. As the dream that keeps returning, the one you wake from and carry with you longer than you should. The unlived life is the source of neurosis. Not the painful life, not the difficult life, the unlived one. The one you quietly set aside to become the person the world needed you to be. So here's what the darkness has actually been doing. The dissolution, the nigredo, the long disorienting collapse of everything that used to hold its shape. It isn't the end of you. It's the unlived life pressing back through the surface. It's the person you almost became, finally gathering enough force to break through the false structure and insist on existing. This is what the best chapter is made from. Not new achievements stacked onto the old foundation. A life rebuilt from what is actually true about you. This is what we might call the second half of life, and it has nothing to do with age. Some people arrive at this threshold at 28, some at 62, and some never arrive at all. They spend their entire lives in the first chapter, the one built from inherited expectations and borrowed scripts, and never discover what was waiting beneath it. What determines whether someone crosses has less to do with how much they've suffered than you might expect. What brings a person through is a specific kind of honesty, the willingness to look clearly at the life they've been living and acknowledge that it was built at least in part from fear, from obligation, from the accumulated weight of everything everyone who ever shaped them needed them to become. And then to decide quietly and without drama that the years ahead won't be built the same way. The people who come through the threshold develop something that almost no other experience produces, a quality of presence, a way of inhabiting their own lives that other people can sense without being able to name it. They make decisions from alignment rather than pressure. They can tolerate uncertainty because they've already survived the most disorienting uncertainty possible, not knowing who they are. They can be alone without loneliness because they discovered, somewhere in the gap, that the companionship they'd been reaching for in the external world was available from inside them all along. That's the rubedo. Not a life without difficulty. A life that is finally, genuinely, irreversibly your own. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not the most successful version of the persona you constructed, not the most polished iteration of the script you inherited. Who you actually are beneath the performance, beneath the fear, beneath everything you became so that others wouldn't leave. That's what this threshold is trying to give you. That's what all of it has been in service of. Your only work right now is to stay, to resist the pull back toward what is familiar but finished, to trust that the darkness isn't empty, that the gap isn't permanent, that the ground will steady again beneath a version of you that is more real than the one that stood on it before. You're not falling apart, you're being prepared.